This video was brought to you by my loyal patrons. Pledge today and receive exclusive perks. Link in the description. Welcome back to the railway, everyone. Last time you saw me build some stations, pave a harbor, and begin forming a mountain. Today I will share the progress that I've made since then, including building a new loop line, shaping the hills, and adding a little color into this miniature world. Let's not waste any more time. Let's get into it. So let's start out this video with a bit of a story. This year I went to Europe with my wife. We went to Paris, London, and even traveled up to York to go to the National Railway Museum. And while there, I made a rather unwise purchase. This streamlined coronation class by Hornby. And, well, I couldn't have an LMS coronation without a train for it to pull, right? So I also bought a rake of coaches. And when we got home, I wanted to run my new train. But I got a little annoyed by the fact that I couldn't give it a good run-in, my layout being an end-to-end layout and all. After much consideration, I decided to just do it. Add another loop at the other end to create one complete circuit. Thankfully, adding a loop would not involve totally redoing the track plan like before, but it would involve extending the two main running lines through the rear of the big station to a new board with the loop to fully turn the trains around. Now to do this, I had to be savvy with the space I had. I don't have a lot of space here, as the wall ends a couple feet after the station. Our water heater is also right there, and I did not want to fully block that either. The biggest the board could possibly be here was 3 feet by 3 feet, so the loop would have to somehow fit on that. Just like the other tables, I used my table saw to cut the wood. A lot of careful measuring and careful cutting here to ensure that everything fit right. Huzzah! Perfect height. And there's even a little space left between the boards for a cutoff board to rest in. More on that in a bit. I thought I was so clever to have the foresight to place these points at the station throat where I did, just in case I ever wanted to modify the running lines to do exactly this. But it ultimately did not matter, because I ended up having to pull up tracks anyway to move some of the station points around. But nothing too tedious. As this is a 3 foot by 3 foot board, it meant that standard radius 2 curves that most model companies recommend would not fit on this, as a full radius 2 diameter is 36 inches, or exactly 3 feet. I would have to go a little bit tighter. As I discovered all the way back in part 1, if you remember, most 00 locos manage the tighter radius 1 curves just fine. But since I'm going to be running trains at pretty moderate speeds on this, I struck a balance between the two and made a mix of radius 1 and 2 curves, creating a roughly 33-inch diameter. It just fits. Nice. Some of the wiring had to be redone so the entire main line was powered by one circuit, because as you all may remember, half the main line was sectioned on a separate power source before. Now the station yard is on its own section, and that involved moving its power source just after the main point to it. Alright, everything's set and wired. Let's test her out. That was pretty good. No derailments. And this is a long wheelbase loco too. If a Duchess can handle this without derailing, then I feel pretty confident that mostly everything else will too. One thing I did notice though was that the Coronation's bogie wheels tended to jump up on this curve. Now this is a full radius 1 curve, and I figured I should probably make that a bit broader to avoid any potential derailments in future. There we go. Refitted with a radius 2, and we should be good to go now. Beautiful. Alright, now the cutoff board. My plan is to hide the fact that there is a loop there. I cut a rectangle out of the board to create space for tunnel portals, and I'll eventually decorate the board with a city backdrop to make it look like the main line disappears under the city, like something you'd typically see at a London station. Because of the two big major curves here, two double-length portals will have to be used, one for the upper line and one for the down, to give the trains enough clearance to make it through. To make the loop seem even less obvious, I added a fake point here, to make it look like that the double-track main line just continues straight into the tunnel, while the real track of the loop appears as an offshoot branch line going elsewhere south. In actuality, this new siding is utterly pointless. It's purely decorative, but I could use it to store a train on out of the way, out of sight, if I ever needed to. And that is where the new loop line is currently at. Next steps will be to fully build the tunnel portals here and dress it with a backdrop. God, it is so satisfying being able to run trains like this now. I know that I keep changing my mind on what I want to do with this layout. I think I've changed the track plan like 3 different times at this point, and I kind of wish that I had the foresight to do this from the beginning. But hey, what you gonna do? A model railway is constantly evolving, and that's the fun of it. I promised you all tunnels last time, so I am very happy to present tunnels. Let's first cover the tunnel in the corner here. So I always wanted a tunnel under a hill in this corner of the layout to have a sort of visual separator from the metropolitan main yard and the more green countryside, with a church on the top of it. Because what's more English than a church on a green hilltop, right? So let's just call this area Churchill. Churchill. Funny. As you all may remember from previous parts, I kit-bashed a road bridge for the old version of the layout. Once I changed the track plan around, this bridge didn't really have a use, so I found a way to incorporate it. A road will now cross the railway here via this bridge, and then continue around the hill here. Through the hill on the ground level will be the railway tunnel, with its exit portal behind the bridge a bit. I used some leftover styrofoam risers to form the area where the road will be, holding those in place with glue, and then I'll form the hill shape around it. I don't want the road system of the layout to seem like an afterthought, so I added this ramp down to the yard from the road to explain how work lorries and cars get here. And, you know, the occasional birdie bus. Yippee! I built this ramp out of styrofoam strips, and the top layer is leftover incline risers from the hill that I built down to the harbor. I created a stencil with card to get a rough idea of the shape the styrofoam board would have to be cut to fill the hill space. I cut the boards with an X-Acto knife, and then began filling the space in. I glued these all down, and held them down with paint cans while they dried. I did not want any of that white styrofoam to show through when you look inside the tunnel, so I covered the interior of the walls with a strip of poster card that I cut and spray paint black. There we go. You can't see any white. I kept cutting away styrofoam pieces and building up the hill until it was at a height that I was happy with. And there she is, Church Hill, standing proudly above all, looking over the layout. Now, I probably should have learned from the tunnel on my last layout to create some sort of access point within it, so I could get an engine if it derailed inside. But since the tunnel itself is such a short distance, and not 4 feet away from me like before, I figured it was fine. Next thing I did was paint the tunnel portal. So for the east end, I'm using a plastic stone wall tunnel portal by Model Scene. It's just gray plastic, there's no real paint decoration on it, so I did that myself. I first primed it with a light gray, and then once dry, painted it in a darker slate gray. Then, just as I did before with the narrow gauge tunnels, coated it with a white wash. This is white paint mixed with water to thin it out a bit. I let it sit for a couple minutes, then wiped off the excess. I did this so the white would settle into creases between the stones and create some definition. Much better. Here's a comparison between my painted tunnel and an unpainted one. It's minor, but even the slightest details make a difference. Once that was fixed in place, the next step was to start shaping the slopes of the hill. Now I've seen a lot of different ways to do this, but I decided to go with the old method of chicken wire. So this is pretty basic chicken wire that you can find at any hardware store. It's light and it bends easily, perfect for what I need. I went and cut it into small pieces with my rail cutter and bent them into shape. I just started placing the strips in random places to start shaping the area, with no real rhyme or reason, just until it started to form semi-even gradients. I didn't glue them or staple them in place or anything. Some of them were held in place just by stabbing them into the styrofoam here, and some just lay freely. Admittedly, that's probably not the best way to do this, but it worked for me. Next up, the fun part, plaster cloth. I think this is also called mod rock for those of you watching in the UK. Basically, it's a type of cloth with plaster infused into it. It works just like paper mache. You cut it into strips, dip it in water, and then lay it on whatever surface. Once it dries, the plaster hardens and creates a terrain-like surface. Since my chicken wire isn't securely fastened, I did a couple coats of cloth pretty much everywhere to ensure that the hill would stay stable. I worked my way around the hill until it was completely coated. And the next day, once it was fully dry, rock hard. We have a hill now. That looks pretty good. The area is really starting to take shape with this fully in place. Let's move on over to Narrow Gauge Mountain now. So I've been calling the mountain on the right side of the layout Narrow Gauge Mountain because it, well, has the narrow gauge loop on it. Pretty obvious, I think. None of these places have official names as of yet, so for now, that's what I'm going to keep calling it. So I bought single track tunnel portals from Model Scene for these tunnels too. The one at the rear looks perfect, but they did not work on the two in the front here. There's quite a bit too much overhang, and they were just too close together. The retaining walls collided into each other, and I just did not think that this looked good. So I found these flatter European-style portals by Bush on Amazon, and I think they fit the area here much better. Just like the previous, I painted all the portals here to match. Primed in gray, then a dark coat, and finished them with a white wash to fill in the creases. Shaping the hills with styrofoam strips proved to be a lot more difficult on this mountain than Churchill, because there are 5 tunnel portals on this one I had to work around. This was a long and tedious process, using small pieces and strips mostly, but eventually I got it all to look a way I was pretty satisfied with. Next step was, you guessed it, chicken wire. The lower area was super easy to place the wire into, since it just poked into the styrofoam and held in place. I get why so many modelers sometimes add a thin bottom layer of styrofoam on their layouts now. It makes doing stuff like this so much simpler. I think this is something I'll be adding to all my future layouts. Plaster cloth was next, repeating the same process as before. And once that was dry, wow. I was kind of amazed with how it all shaped up. It's actually starting to look like a proper mountain now. While I had everything out, I also created a little shore down to the water in the harbor here. Next step was to get all this white cloth covered with a base layer of paint to begin the scenery. I broke out the brown paint and just started going to town. No real reason or rhyme to it. Just put on a podcast and began painting away. Any white that was showing had to be covered. I used a tinier brush to paint around the edges of the tunnel portals to not risk getting any brown on them. I even had a little help with this part. What do you think of that, Mosby? Looking good? And there she is. A very muddy looking mountain. Hardly any white anywhere. Mosby approved. After all that mess, I cleaned off the rails with a track rubber and ran some trains. Peter Sam here seems to enjoy the new look of his home. Alright, let's make this look pretty. It's taken ages to get to this point, but it's time to finally start some scenery. I have never done scenery before, at least in the way that it should be done. So we're all going to learn together how to do this as I go. First things first, ballasting. So just like how I've done before, I laid all the ballast down using a spoon and spread it evenly. I did it for the narrow gauge section too, and I was a little scared to do it here since everything is so much smaller and finer up here, but I didn't have any issues. I also sprayed the cardboard that I'm using for the halt's platform gray before laying the ballast down and glued that in place. Frustratingly, some of the plaster drippage leaked onto the tunnel portals, leaving big white stains on them. So I painted over those areas again with the slate gray, and then once dried, gave them another layer of whitewash. I repeated this process for all the tunnel portals, so they all looked fairly unified with each other. As Narrow Gauge Mountain has, well, a narrow gauge railway on it, I knew I wanted it to be rocky. All the slate they transport in their wagons has to come from somewhere, right? So I looked into rocks. And what I found were these broken up pieces of slate on Amazon for use in aquariums and terrariums. They are produced in various sizes, so I bought a couple of different ones to try out. I started placing the larger pieces in more flatter angled areas, especially near the tunnel portals, to give the impression that these tunnels were bored through a bluff of sorts. This whole process was like putting together a puzzle, just adding rocks in various spaces and gaps where I thought that they looked appropriate. And once they were all in an orientation that I liked, I glued each rock in place. I enjoyed this process a lot. I found it really satisfying. At this time, I also placed some black card strips on the sides of the tunnels to hide how they obviously are just placed in front of a cutoff board. I'll eventually add longer strips on both sides to really hide the other side showing through from multiple angles. The next step was the ground cover. Using a mix of half glue and half water, I painted glue all around the rocks wherever brown was visible. And while it was still wet, I sprinkled some dark green turf onto it, covering as much of the brown as possible. And there we go! We finally got some green down. This is truly the step of the scenery process where the look of the layout completely transforms. I took it one small section at a time, adding more rocks and turf in areas that I thought looked appropriate. Once the green was down, I added some bushes. Now this is really starting to look good. I mixed up the colors of bushes that I used, adding a blend of dark and light green, and I think that variance really helps the area look a tad more real. But we haven't even made it to the best part yet. We still have static grass to lay. So I have never ever laid static grass before. This is my first time ever trying it out. And man oh man, do I love static grass. So this is how it works. You have this battery-powered wand sort of contraption with a tub at the top. The tub is what you'll fill with your static grass. The top of the tub has a metal mesh that you'll shake the grass out of, like shaking pepper out of a shaker. There's an exposed wire inside that touches the mesh. Do not touch that while it is turned on, it will shock you, and the electricity from it causes the grass to shake out vertically. The other end of that wire has a clip that you're meant to hold. You touch that to the area that you want to lay your grass, and the current causes the grass to land upright. Shake the wand a couple times, cover your area with as much grass as you want, and boom! Grass! It looks a total mess at first, but once it dries and you blow the excess away, holy moly does this look so good. It adds so much definition to the ground and hides all the creases and imperfections in the plaster cloth. Not to mention, it just feels so nice to the touch.
It's like a sheep!
As I went along, I discovered that I didn't really need to do a layer of green turf under it. The static grass alone was enough, so that's something that I'll keep in mind moving forward. It's funny, going into this, I always dreaded doing the scenery because I thought it would be such a pain to do and to get it to look right. But honestly, it's so easy. This has been the most satisfying part of the whole project so far. I've really enjoyed this. This area is really starting to look like a mountainside bluff, the perfect place for a little cottage to overlook it all. Speaking of which, let's take a closer look at that. So I was very gratefully sent some buildings by Tom Marshall, owner of the Buggleskelly Station model shop. He designs and prints all his buildings, and he sent a few over to me of my choice to review. The first item I chose was the mountainside cottage from the episode Bulldog, aka where the crew got buckets of water during the whole Falcon nearly falling to his death fiasco. This is such a fine print. The brick texture is 3D, it has gutter detail. Overall, a really nice building. It's solid resin material too. It does not feel like it would shatter if I knocked it over by accident and it landed on carpet or something. Also included with the cottage is this little tank, complete with separate stands. I am not totally sure what this is. I think it's a water tank, but it is there in the episode, and it will display like so on my layout. The other building I chose was the barber shop from A Close Shave, post-crash, if you couldn't tell. Like the cottage, it's a solid print with 3D planking all around it. I absolutely love this building in particular because it has a complete interior. You can see roof supports and everything. It's actually in two separate pieces. The exterior is a shell and it slides right off, just like this. And here is everything from the inside. There's a couple desks in there, some chairs, the back door, and even that giant can thing that's also there in the episode. It's so clever how the top can just slide off. It'll make painting this a lot easier. The Bulldog Cottage will go right beside the narrow gauge tunnel, similar to how it is positioned in the show. The barber shop, however, I have another plan for. That will go right here, in front of the retaining walls near the road bridge. I'll eventually add some other town buildings beside it and create a little town scene with a road in front of it. I changed the position of the station siding here slightly, so now it ends right before the shop. A perfect space to create a little crash scene. I think you bumped those trucks just a little too hard there, Percy.
Who cares?
I'm pretty impressed with these buildings, and I will probably grab a couple others once I start figuring out my town scenes. I highly recommend that you go check out Buggleskelly Station's site. There is plenty more there, all sorts of buildings and rolling stock pop culture related, not just Thomas. Fair warning, there is an up to 12-week printing period at the moment, so it may take a little bit of time for you to receive your model. But if you use the code TUG10 at checkout, you will receive 10% off any buildings that you order. Link in the description. Alrighty. I think it's time we had a running session. My goal for part 6 is to simply get more of the scenery done. I'd like all the hills to be green by the next video, and maybe even get some road down too. I'd also like to get more of the tracks ballasted across the layout. The whole shed yard here is looking a little bare, I think. My original plan was to have a ruined castle of sorts at the top of Narrow Gauge Mountain, but there's not as much space there as I thought there would be, so the cottage will take its place. Now I'm thinking I might replace the church on Church Hill with a ruined castle, since there's a lot more space up there. I'll look further into that. If you have any recommendations on suitable ruined castle sets or kits, let me know below. This week's pick is actually a series of videos that I have been rewatching a lot lately. Sudrian Histories by Railway Mania. His AU of Sodor is incredibly well thought out, and he has an entire fleet of custom models for it. There's a spotlight video for each model that he's done, which explains their name, their livery choice, specific details that stray from the books, etc. These videos are a couple years old now, but I've been in a very model-y mood lately, and rewatching these has gotten me inspired to redo some of my own Sodor engines. If you also need some inspiration, go give his stuff a watch. Link to the playlist of all his videos is below. It hasn't been long since the last video, so I don't really have a whole lot to update you all on. At the time of posting this video, it is Thanksgiving weekend here in the US. So a happy Thanksgiving to all of my American viewers. I am with family at the moment, so when I return home, I will be jumping right into the next video. I think I'm still leaning towards the Season 13 retrospective, but I'm still undecided. So you tell me below, what video do you want to see next? Should we end the year with the retrospective, or something else? Would love to hear what you all think. Short outro today. Thanks for the support as always, everyone, and I will see you all soon. Stay safe out there. Bye-bye.